So, lastly, I just want to turn briefly to the highlights of the operating report, which you have in your report. We're now 7 months into the fiscal year, and I think our budget reflects the national trends. You'll see operating revenue about 6% below our fiscal year 10 budget, and operating expenses are about 2% under budget. This continues the trends that we've been seeing each month. And again, payroll tax revenues are lower than where we budgeted last year because the drop in employment was greater than we and others anticipated in our budget last spring. And also passenger revenue is lower because as the recession is deeper than we anticipated, fewer people are riding, although Fred noted some flattening of that decline. On the expenditure side, the expenditures reflect the cuts we made in the budget last year. And in fact, our expenditures are coming in even lower than where we budgeted. So we're not overspending. It's just that revenues are down more than expenses were. And this means that to get through the year with a balanced budget as required, we'll be using some of our budgeted contingency to keep our budget balanced. And that means that we draw down our reserves a bit. And so our starting point for our budgets are linked. So our starting point for fiscal year 11 will be slightly lower than where we would be if revenues and expenses were both on budget. Happy to take any questions.
Are we still at a three-month level as far as Fred's shaking his head so he knows what I'm thinking?
No, we've been looking at on our we've been looking at cash, and it's something we discussed in Finance Committee. I think in the past maybe you were looking at working capital, which is a mixture of cash and not cash. And Finance Committee we discussed to look at where our cash, which is what we define as unrestricted, and we're somewhere most months around 1, maybe 2 months of cash. So we're definitely lower than where we have been over the long term.
Let me stress, though, a part of the purpose of the policy, your policy, was to make sure that there was enough working capital that if, in fact, the kind of these very events that we have had, that there is a cushion so we can at least glide to that lower level by utilizing that extra cash, and that's clearly what has been happening here. The concern, and Beth articulates it very well, is if coming out of this recession is slow, then it means the ability to be able to replenish that as fast as we think is important gets compromised. But that's it's being used just as you had intended, which is to give us the glide path to deal with a deep recession such as what we have.
Yeah, you talked about the housing market. Does that include commercial property?
I was talking. My statistics were about the housing. Yes.
Because the commercial side is
not
becoming a
bigger
problem.
That's what reports this month where it's sort of the next shoe to drop. But I don't have the statistics on that with me. But you're right, it is a concern.
Thank you, Beth. As Beth is leading, one thing I think it would be valuable to point out, because this is kind of a breaking news issue. We talked earlier about, obviously, the $27 million hole we have in the upcoming budget. If you think back to the original stimulus bill, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, we used about 30% of the dollars that we received under that to be able to offset service reductions both in the current year and reserved the same amount, that is about 15%, to be used to be able to offset service reductions in the upcoming budget. So that $27 million reduction we need drops to about $20 million. That is, we used about $7.25 million each year. There's been a lot of debate in the Congress about is there to be a second jobs bill. The U.S. House of Representatives in December passed a bill, I think they entitled it Jobs for Main Street. In that legislation, we would be receiving money that, and every other transit agency, that could be used to help offset. The Senate version, which you saw in the news, the 5 Republican votes that came over to not to cut off a filibuster on their jobs bill, That's moving along, is expected to pass by the end of this week. It, however, has no provisions that would assist us on the financing side. So the issue is going to be, one, will they do anything in a conference committee, or will the House just accede to the Senate version, which there are some indications they might. And even if they did, is there a second bill that might come along that's going to be addressing some of the other shortfalls that we and every other transit agency has? But I just want to be able to give you a sense that the relief from the federal level, although we were hopeful with the House bill, it is, I think, a much bleaker picture given the Senate bill and not knowing what's going to come out between the two. So anything that we can get Congress to do to be able to address the version that allows transit agencies to be able to get some relief. Again, our issues, although very, very serious here, if you look at Chicago or New York or other places, it's a lot worse, but that doesn't make it any easier for us. Thanks, Matt.
President, outside of asking them for the $27 million to tide us over, what would you consider really helpful coming out of Congress?
Well, what ideally would be is essentially what they provided last time, and that is on the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. They provided dollars that could do two things for us. One, we could use it for preventative maintenance. And essentially what that allows us to do is to be able to pay our mechanics with the federal dollars and not have to use general fund dollars to do that, i.e. use those general fund dollars to reduce what service reductions we would need. The second thing is that the legislation had provided that up to 10% of the funds could be used for direct operating assistance. And although we didn't technically need that by the nature of just how our budget is structured, that was something very important to other transit agencies. If it were in this one, it would be helpful as well. So those two items are the pieces that would be very important to be able to be held out of the House legislation. Generally what has to happen is, though, the Senate jobs bill is really addressing things like tax credits and other things. It is not direct dollars that flow through to be able to have public entities other than highway departments or highway divisions to be able to really fund those activities. So that's where we're kind of looking to be able to see where things are. But it would be very helpful, one, first money, and then have it flexible enough so that it can actually be used to offset service reductions. Okay. Very good. And our delegation, by the way, knows this, obviously very important, but the process in Washington, D.C. is very tough.